months, possibly years, of coordinated effort. And even if they succeeded, no one truly knew what the island would become afterward. Would forests return? Would animals come back? Or would the landscape remain permanently scarred by more than a century of grazing? In the year 2000, the operation began. Nearly 2,000 goats were targeted for removal on Santiago alone during the early phases. But what followed would reveal something scientists had long hoped for and feared. Because beneath the barren soil of the island, hidden in silence for generations, the forest had been waiting. When the operation began in the year 2000, Santiago Island was still dominated by goats. They moved in loose herds across volcanic slopes, along dry riverbeds, and through the scattered remains of the island's vegetation. Some animals lived near the coast. Others climbed high into the island's rugged interior, where lava flows and craters created a labyrinth of natural barriers. From the ground, the landscape looked deceptively empty. But the goats were everywhere. For conservationists, the challenge was not simply removing animals. It was removing every single one. On islands, partial solutions rarely work. If even a small breeding group survives, the population can rebound in just a few years. A handful of goats could eventually grow into thousands again. So the strategy had to be absolute. The eradication effort became part of a large-scale conservation campaign known as Project Isabella, one of the most ambitious island restoration programs ever attempted. The project targeted invasive goats across several islands of the Galapagos Islands, but Santiago presented a unique test. It was large, rugged, and heavily degraded. And yet, scientists believed that if goats could be removed here, it would prove that even severely damaged ecosystems might still recover. The early phase of the operation relied on aerial hunting. Helicopters swept low across the island, following herds visible from the air. Skilled marksmen worked from open doors, tracking animals as they scattered across the volcanic terrain below. It was fast, precise, but not enough. Goats are intelligent animals. Within weeks, the surviving herds adapted. They began hiding in dense ravines and steep lava fields where helicopters could not safely approach. They moved at night. They scattered into smaller groups. What began as a straightforward removal effort quickly turned into a complex ecological pursuit. To overcome this, scientists adopted an unusual strategy. They introduced what became known as Judas goats. A Judas goat is a sterilized animal fitted with a radio tracking collar. Because goats are highly social, a lone individual will instinctively seek out other goats to form a herd. By releasing these collared animals back into the landscape, conservation teams could track them from the air. Wherever the Judas goat traveled, other goats would eventually appear. Once a group was located, helicopters could move in again. The technique had been used before on smaller islands, but never at this scale. Across Santiago Island, dozens of Judas goats were released. Each one became a living tracking device. Each one led hunters to hidden pockets of the remaining population. Over time, the numbers began to fall. Thousands became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. But the final animals proved the most difficult to find. The last surviving goats often lived in the most remote parts of the island. Steep volcanic cliffs, isolated lava fields, and dry upland plateaus where visibility was poor. Months stretched into years. Teams flew repeated aerial surveys, searching for movement across the landscape. And finally, after years of effort, the moment came. By 2006, Santiago Island was declared free of goats. More than 79,000 goats had been removed across the island during the full operation. For the first time in more than a century, the ecosystem was no longer under constant grazing pressure. But removing goats was only the first step. The real question remained unanswered. What would happen next? When large herbivores disappear from an ecosystem, the response can be unpredictable. In some landscapes, vegetation returns rapidly. In others, the damage has gone too far. Seeds may have vanished. Soil may be too degraded. Native species may no longer have the ability to recolonize. On Santiago Island, scientists began monitoring the land almost immediately. permanent research plots were established across different elevations and soil types. Researchers measured plant growth, counted seedlings, and recorded changes in species composition. The first year passed. Then the second. At first, the landscape seemed unchanged. Large areas remained bare. Erosion scars still cut across the slopes. But beneath the surface, subtle processes were already beginning. One of the most powerful forces in ecosystem recovery is something known as the seed bank. In many environments, seeds remain buried in soil for years, sometimes decades, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Some seeds only sprout when sunlight reaches the ground. Others require moisture levels that only occur when vegetation returns. And many native plants evolved specifically to survive periods of disturbance. For more than a century, Santiago's seed bank had been suppressed. Goats consumed seedlings almost immediately after they emerged. Plants rarely survived long enough to reproduce and expand. But the seeds were still there, dormant, waiting. Once the grazing pressure disappeared, sunlight began reaching the soil again. Rainfall could soak into the ground without being immediately stripped of vegetation. And slowly, small green shoots began appearing across the island. At first, they were easy to miss. Tiny plants pushing through cracks in volcanic rock. A scattering of young shrubs along dry stream beds. Seedlings growing beneath the protection of lava outcrops, where goats had once struggled to reach. But year after year, the pattern grew clearer. Plants were returning. Among the earliest species to rebound were hardy pioneer plants, species adapted to colonize disturbed environments. One of the most important was the Scalesia pedunculata, often called the Darwin's finch tree. Scalesia forests once covered large areas of the Galapagos Highlands. These trees grow quickly compared to many other island plants, forming dense canopy cover that shades the soil and creates stable microclimates. For decades, goats had prevented young Scalesia trees from surviving. Now, without grazing pressure, seedlings began appearing again. In some valleys, thousands of young trees emerged within just a few seasons. As the vegetation returned, another transformation began. Soil stabilized. Plant roots held the ground in place, slowing erosion. Leaf litter accumulated, gradually rebuilding the thin organic layer that supports microbial life. Moisture remained in the soil longer after rainfall. And with plants came insects. Insects returned to feed on leaves, flowers, and decaying organic matter. These small organisms form the base of nearly every terrestrial food web. Where insects thrive, larger animals soon follow. Birds were among the first to respond. Species that had rarely been seen on the island began appearing more frequently, drawn by the increasing abundance of insects and the growing availability of nesting sites. But the most dramatic change was still yet to come, because some species that once lived on Santiago Island had not merely declined. They had disappeared entirely. And now, as the vegetation slowly returned, scientists began to consider an extraordinary possibility. What if the island was finally ready for them to come back? By the end of the first decade after the goats were removed, Santiago Island was no longer the barren landscape scientists remembered. Green patches had begun to spread across valleys, once stripped to bare volcanic soil. Shrubs returned along seasonal streams. Young trees clustered in sheltered pockets where wind and sunlight created favorable conditions. The change was slow, but it was unmistakable. For researchers who had walked the island in the 1990s, the transformation felt almost surreal. Areas that had once looked like open desert now held dense vegetation reaching waist height or higher. Yet the most important transformation was not simply the return of plants. It was the rebuilding of an entire ecological network. On islands, ecosystems function like tightly woven systems of dependency. Plants feed insects. Insects feed reptiles and birds. Trees provide shade, nesting habitat, and food for dozens of species simultaneously. When goats consumed the vegetation of Santiago Island, they didn't just remove plants. They unraveled the entire system. Now slowly, that system was rebuilding itself. Researchers from the Galapagos National Park Directorate and collaborating universities began conducting long-term ecological surveys across the island. Permanent vegetation plots revealed remarkable changes. Within just 10 years of goat removal, plant cover in many monitored areas had increased by 300 to 400%. Seedling density, the number of young plants growing in each square meter, rose dramatically. In regions where only a few scattered shrubs had survived, dense clusters of native plants began forming new vegetation layers. But the most surprising discovery came from the highland forests. Before goats arrived in the 1800s, Santiago Island supported large stands of Scalesia pedunculata. These trees form one of the most distinctive forest ecosystems in the Galapagos Islands. Scalesia forests grow quickly compared to other island trees, sometimes reaching 10 meters in height within a decade. Their wide leaves create a humid canopy that allows mosses, insects, and smaller plants to thrive beneath them. But goats had almost completely erased these forests from Santiago. Young Scalesia seedlings were eaten before they could mature. For decades, scientists believed that restoring these forests might require active planting programs. Yet when researchers returned to the highlands a few years after goat removal, they found something extraordinary. Thousands of young Scalesia trees were already growing. Hidden in the soil for decades, dormant seeds had waited for the moment grazing pressure disappeared. Once the goats were gone, the forest began rebuilding itself. By the mid-2010s, aerial surveys showed entire sections of the island turning green again. From above, the transformation was visible even from satellite images. Formerly barren hillsides now supported thick vegetation. Erosion scars began to fade. Natural drainage patterns reappeared as plant roots stabilized the ground. But plants alone do not create ecosystems. Animals had to return as well. One of the most symbolic recoveries involved a reptile that had once vanished entirely from Santiago Island. The Galapagos land iguana had historically played an important role in shaping the island's vegetation. These large reptiles feed heavily on cactus pads and fruits, helping disperse seeds across the landscape. Their burrows also aerate the soil, creating microhabitats for insects and small plants. But as goats consumed the island's cactus forests, the iguanas disappeared. By the 1970s, they were gone. With the vegetation now returning, conservationists saw an opportunity. If the habitat could support them again, perhaps the iguanas could be brought back. Beginning in 2019, scientists launched a reintroduction program. Young land iguanas bred on nearby islands were transported to Santiago and released into areas where vegetation had sufficiently recovered. At first, researchers monitored the animals closely. Would they survive? Would the habitat provide enough food? Early observations were promising. The iguanas began feeding on returning cactus plants and native shrubs. They established territories. They dug burrows in the volcanic soil. In essence, they resumed their ancient ecological role, a role that had been missing from the island for nearly half a century. Birds were also returning. Several species of Darwin's finches began nesting more frequently on Santiago as vegetation density increased. These small birds depend heavily on seeds, insects, and plant cover. As plant diversity expanded, so did the finches' food supply. Their presence marked another milestone in the island's recovery. Because finches are not just inhabitants of the ecosystem. They are indicators of its health. The same birds that once helped inspire Charles Darwin to think about evolution were now quietly signaling that the ecosystem beneath them was functioning again. 18 years after the goats were removed, Santiago Island had changed in ways few scientists initially predicted. Vegetation had expanded across most of the island. Native plant species that once seemed lost were spreading again. Soil erosion had slowed dramatically. Bird populations were increasing. Reptiles were returning. In many areas, the landscape looked closer to its pre-grazing condition than anyone had imagined possible. But perhaps the most important lesson from Santiago Island was not about goats. It was about resilience. Ecosystems often appear fragile. When forests disappear or soils erode, the damage can seem permanent. But nature carries memory in unexpected places. Seeds buried beneath soil, roots waiting beneath rock, microbes surviving in dormant states. Even after more than a century of intense grazing, the ecological blueprint of Santiago Island had not vanished. It had only been suppressed. Once the pressure was removed, the system began rebuilding itself. Not instantly, not perfectly, but steadily. Across the world, invasive species now threaten thousands of island ecosystems. Goats, rats, cats, pigs, animals introduced by humans centuries ago, continue to reshape landscapes in ways that native species cannot easily withstand. Yet Santiago Island offers something rare in conservation science: a large-scale example of recovery, proof that restoration is possible, even after generations of ecological damage. Today,